Right. Can we dim the light a little bit? That's possible.
That's a tough light.
All right. They'll turn that down and pick off. Yep. I don't. Maybe just turn it. Push it up. Is that a bit better? The light? Brilliant. Should be.
Test.
All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone. So in keeping with the last presentation, we're now ready to go for our Are You Ready for Stir Shaken panel, which has been led by Philip Macrez, who's a principal with Klein Law Group. Philip, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're having a great afternoon. Kind of stretch time. We're in the 7th inning stretch, and we don't want to slow you down from having happy hour, but let's talk a little bit about Stir Shaken before we turn it into Stir Shaken happy hour cocktails. But as a brief introduction of the topic, on June 30th, 2023, all IP voice service providers will need to have implemented the FCC's Stir Shaken framework, unless they fall in one of the remaining narrow exceptions. Now, over the course of the past year, under this framework, the FCC has taken additional significant steps to stop illegal robocalling in the US. In particular, adopted orders on May 20th, 2022, then on March 17th, 2023, and now looks to adopt another one in just a few days, May 18th of this year, that impose significant additional new requirements on domestic voice service providers, intermediate providers, gateway providers, along with foreign voice service providers and foreign intermediate providers. So that's a mouthful. That's basically the whole ecosystem of voice service providers. Now, during this session, we will start with an overview of the Stir Shaken framework in the United States, and then discuss the new requirements in the FCC's orders that it adopted or are going to be adopted later this week, expected to be adopted. And we'll discuss this framework and how it's working and stopping illegal robocalls in the US. Now, my name is Philip Macrez, and I am a principal with the Klein Law Group, and I assist clients in implementing the Stir Shaken obligations and complying with these new and evolving changes of law, which have really kept us all busy as the FCC is looking to refine them and stop the illegal robocalling. On this panel, I am delighted to have industry experts who are well-versed on US obligations and who will share their firsthand experiences in implementing these requirements, along how these requirements serve to prevent unlawful robocalling in the US, so that the US network basically can be trusted again and is not compromised with annoying, harassing, and problematic illegal robocalls. So to my left is Linda Vanderloop from AT&T, and next we have Nick Reichnauer. Nick, I think I got it right.
You did get it, yep.
Okay, great, from Sync. Then we have Justin Davis from Somos and Jim Dalton from TransNexus. Now, before we launch into the discussion, I would like to each of the esteemed panelists to tell me and tell the whole group here of the work they do related to the ecosystem of Stir Shaken and in implementing the FCC's rules and requirements relative to these Stir Shaken obligations. So, Linda, I turn to you.
Hey, it's working. I'm in AT&T's Federal Regulatory Group, and I have been working on robocall issues since 2016, when the chairman of the FCC asked my chairman to lead a industry-wide robocall strike force. And ever since then, we have been, as an industry, and it's been a very, very collaborative process, we have been working on expanding our toolbox and also building partnerships, because it really does take a lot of partnerships. There's no silver bullet, and it definitely takes a village to go after these robocalls. So along with the strike force, I'm involved with the industry traceback group, where we trace back the robocalls to the origination point. And also I chair the STIGA Governance Authority, which oversees, it's the Industry Governance Authority, which oversees the management of the attestations for identifying when a robocall or when a call has not been spoofed.
Excellent, excellent. And Nick?
Hi, Nick Reifschneider with Cinch. We are part of the U.S. voice ecosystem and an important player in the fact that about 25 billion minutes a month go through our network. So we're in a great position to help stop illegal robocalling and spam calls. And I'm VP of Product at Cinch. My group is tasked with deploying our stir shaken service, also finding illegal robocallers within our network and removing them. And then we also are part of our KYC, Know Your Customer implementation, as well as our Know Your Upstream Provider implementation. So my group is directly focused on how, as Cinch Voice, as part of our ecosystem, we can stop illegal robocalling within the U.S.
Great. Justin?
Yeah, so Justin Davis, I'm in the public policy organization at Somos. And Somos, we are the North American Numbering Plan Administrator, we're the toll-free number administrator, and we're also the reassigned number dates administrator. And above and beyond that, we have solutions that we have developed, specifically the most comprehensive DNO, or Do Not Originate solution that's out there today. And beyond that, our affiliate XConnect extends us into the global reach from a number data, number portability perspective. From my perspective, I spent a lot of time in the working groups and the standards development side of things as we continue to not only to develop the initial standards, but also revise those standards as it relates to the mitigation efforts that are in place and that continue to expand from a capability standpoint. Recently spent a lot more time not only addressing things from a federal perspective, but also looking at things also from a state perspective, and the reach beyond not only the service providers, but also to the other utilities and the use cases or corner cases associated with the use of numbers in those environments as well.
Great, great. Jim?
I'm Jim Dalton with TransNexus. We're a software vendor, and we provide software that enables service providers to meet their stir, shake, and compliance requirements for authentication and verification. We're also a shake and certificate authority. And also for compliance, we help our customers with robocall analytics for robocall mitigation, but also to protect their customers from robocalls for inbound calls. So we have a lot of hands-on experience trying to get shaken to work with a lot of different switches in the network and kind of understand those challenges.
Yeah, I must say TransNexus provides tremendous industry updates on the status and the effectiveness of robocalling and how these new rules are being implemented. And it's always, I love seeing the reports, but sometimes it's a love-hate relationship. I'm hoping that we make more progress, but we're making progress slowly but surely. Jim, as we kick this off, why don't you provide, if it's possible, since you do a lot of the softwaring and handling the implementation of stir shaken, if you could just describe for the audience, how is the stir shaken, how does stir shaken designed to prevent illegal robocalls in the United States and instill trust in the nation's voice network?
Sure. First, shaken is at the highest level, really the simplest level. It's a technology standard. It's a definition for secure authentication of telephone calls. And what it does, it gives the originating service provider, the service provider that puts that call onto the IP network from the customer, it gives them a way to define the trust level of the calling number, and that's called attestation. It gives that originating service provider a way to convey the attestation of how much the terminating provider can trust who's calling me. Can I trust this calling number? And there are 3 levels of attestation. The highest level, attestation A, or full attestation, has 2 requirements. It means that originating service provider, they have a direct, authenticated relationship with the customer, and they know who that customer is. And second, they have established a verified association of that calling number with that call. And those are two really powerful tests. That means you really understand who the customer is and they're using the right telephone number that's been assigned to them for that specific call. And we should remember that test because I think a lot of companies kind of use the A attestation perhaps a little bit too loosely. So that's the full attestation, attestation A. Next is partial attestation. And to be able to attest the calling number gets partial attestation means that the originating service provider has a direct authenticated relationship with the customer and can identify the customer. But they haven't been able to establish a verified association between the calling number and the call. So for example, if you're a service provider and you give a SIP trunk to one of your customers, you can't associate that calling number with a call. You just don't know what calling number actually originated that call. So it gets an attestation of B. And then attestation C is the originating provider has really no relationship with whoever originated the call. So that's the important part that, what the Shaken standard defines in terms of attestation, but probably the more powerful piece is the digital signature that Shaken defines of how an originating provider can put their fingerprint, their digital signature into the call signaling that identifies them as the originator of that call and provides the accountability and the integrity that you can trust that calling number when it reaches the far end. And another fact that's really important with this, the fact that you can identify the calling, the originating network is that's very powerful for your robocall analytics. If you know who originated the call, you can't make a decision just on that information, but with other information as part of your robocall analytics, that attestation and who actually signed the call is very important in terms of being able to determine, whether that call is a robocall or not. So that's the technical side. And what Shaken does not do, it does not tell you if it's a robocall or not. We see a lot of robocalls with attestation A. So, Shaken doesn't fix the robocall problem. It just provides the integrity and the accountability of being able to trust the calling number. The other part of Shaken, which is perhaps more important, it's a framework. It's a framework for the entire industry that's, they're coordinated, consolidated policies put into place by a governance authority that has industry-wide input about how the Shaken standard will be applied, how the FCC rules will be implemented, and this is enforced through a policy administrator that applies to all service providers. So really, in my mind, is that Shaken framework of the entire industry is really more powerful than just the authentication standard that's been defined. And so, I think I want to add to this. This is a panel, Are You Ready for Shaken? And, I think there's more we need to discuss in this conversation today. Shaken is kind of the most simplest, well-defined piece of this new regime of FCC compliance. But this new regime of FCC compliance for robocalls has two other really important factors that are part of this. And it's, do you police your network? The burden of originating service providers to police their network and implement robocall mitigation.
Right.
And the third, which I think is probably even the most difficult to really put into place in more early stages, do you know your customer? The vetting processes of carriers, this is a real change. We've always been telephone guys. We've tried to complete every call. Now we've got to know our customers, and that's a real change for the industry.
And Jim, you made a good point here. It's a framework, and we put a foundation in place. Now, the FCC, the United States adopted the Trace Act. That was end of 2019, and they've done a whole bunch of rulemakings, issued a whole bunch of orders in the past few years, and they really put the pedal to the metal in the past year. They put this framework up, this foundation of rules that implement Stir Shaken, and now they're doing a whole bunch more to stop the illegal robocalling. Now, we could be here for 3 or 4 hours talking about all these rulemakings and orders, but what we're going to do is just go through what has happened in the past year. So next, I turn to Justin. So Justin, it was about a year ago, and we just had the ITW, and then the FCC adopted its May 20th, 2022 order, and that was the gateway provider order. And if you could just provide a summary of that order and how those requirements are designed to stop illegal robocalling that impact gateway providers, foreign and U.S. service providers, and foreign and U.S. intermediate providers.
Sure. So, as it relates to that particular order, again, the gateway order is focused on the U.S. numbers as they enter into the U.S. and the ability to be able to treat those numbers. So the gateway order is comprised of the sixth order associated with advanced methods to target and eliminate unwanted robocalls, and the fifth order associated with the call authentication trust anchor. And when we kind of break it down from an order perspective, first and foremost, the FCC, the expectation of the FCC is to provide a certification plan or program within the robocall mitigation database. Further to that, as it relates to the robocall mitigation database, the FCC says that any intermediate and voice service providers will be prohibited from accepting traffic from providers that are not within that robocall mitigation database. And then from an authentication standpoint, it also, again, expands on what Jim just stated, and that's expanding the implementation of STIR/SHAKEN and the ability to be able to authenticate unsigned calls using U.S. numbers as they enter into the U.S. But beyond that, the FCC actually added some additional steps as it relates to that robocall mitigation plan. One of those is the 24-hour traceback response. The next is mandatory blocking of illegal traffic when notified by the commission. Next is mandatory blocking of calls with calling numbers that appear on a reasonable do not originate list, and that reasonable list is comprised of unassigned, unallocated, and invalid U.S. numbers. Further to that, as Jim just stated, is know your customer and your upstream provider. And then finally, take reasonable steps, reasonable actions to be able to mitigate illegal robocalls. So if we think about that and expand on that just a little bit, again, the reasonable D&O list is comprised of those factors, as I stated, that are the unused, unallocated, and invalid. But if you take that a step further and not just look at things from an auto set perspective, but also introduce manual set numbers that are active numbers, but these are numbers that, again, still will not originate robocalls. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to take my household, for instance. So my household is comprised of 12 numbers. And those 12 numbers are cell phone numbers. Those numbers always place and receive calls. They always send and receive texts, and they have the ability to place and receive calls, send and receive texts from an international standpoint. I have 3 connected vehicles. Those connected vehicles, again, they'll always place and receive calls. Likewise, they send and receive data. They'll never send and receive texts, and they'll never place calls outside of North America. And then I have 3 cellular tablets. And cellular tablets are, for the most part, data only. They don't place and receive calls. They don't send and receive text. For the most part, they may or may not travel from an international perspective. These are all, from a consumer standpoint, this is just myself, my household as an individual consumer, these are all characteristics and should be categorized and included from that manual set perspective, because the biggest thing that we have to do is not only introduce the authentication capabilities and not only introduce things as it relates to the highest level of do not originate, but there are a huge amount of numbers out there that are active numbers that will never place calls or send text or a combination of the two. And again, that's the next part, I think, of enriching this even further to mitigate even more.
Now, just conceptually, we talk about the call flow of the gateway provider order. Nick, I know you guys are handling that a lot. Are you a gateway provider? And tell us a little bit about how these obligations apply.
Sure. So at Cinch, we are a gateway provider. We're an intermediate provider. We're a terminating provider. We have a lot of different hats that we wear. But the best way to think about it from the the FCC standpoint is that the FCC obviously controls US-based companies and the point of entry into the US-based network. So because they have the ability to regulate those US-based entities, that is who they're putting the onus on to ensure that, one, they are in the robocall mitigation database, and two, if you're the point of entry into the US-based network, that you are enforcing their rules, which means you may be working with a foreign intermediate provider, you may be working with a foreign service provider, but if you're that first point of entry into the US, the FCC expects you to, one, be in the robocall mitigation database and have a mitigation plan, and then two, your upstream customer to be in the robocall mitigation database, even if they're a foreign service provider. So that's where the FCC is pushing a company like Cinch to ensure that we have customers that aren't under the FCC's control, but to ensure that they're in the robocall mitigation database. And it's something that we take very seriously. But it does cause issues because many times companies may say, well, I'm located in Sweden. I don't need to be, I'm not regulated by the FCC. And that's where they push kind of the ownership on us to explain and make sure people understand that.
Well, thanks. And Linda, so that just leads to our next question. Tell us a little bit about the biggest challenges that gateway providers have, foreign voice service providers have, foreign intermediate providers have. You are right on the edge there. You're obviously, AT&T is a gateway provider, among other things, and wears all the hats. So, I mean, what are you seeing right now?
So, it's funny because when the FCC first came out with the requirement to have international providers register in the robocall mitigation database, we thought, how are we going to do that? We were very surprised that the majority of our international partners have registered. There were some challenges. There were some, challenges from their own country. There were even some challenges if they were service providers in an embargoed country where they had to find a way to actually access the database. But we've overcome those challenges. I think the biggest challenge I see for a gateway provider is, like AT&T, like Cinch, we deal with very large customers who take a lot of traffic from a lot of providers. And sometimes mixed in with all their good traffic, and the majority of it is good traffic, is some bad traffic. And so working with them to identify it and get them to get that traffic stopped is a big challenge. If somebody is only sending us bad traffic, or the majority is bad traffic, it's easy, we just cut them off. But working with other providers to get the small portion of bad traffic stopped is probably one of the biggest challenges I see.
Now, with the gateway provider order as of January 11th, as of April 11th, carriers, domestic providers cannot be routing traffic with those foreign intermediate providers, foreign voice service providers, or gateway providers that are not in the FCC's robocall mitigation database. Have you seen such calls being routed or not routed by such providers that have not filed in the RMD? Like shut off or blocked?
I can take that. In our network, we don't allow any providers that aren't in the RMD to come into our network. But I know the ITG has found via some tracebacks, some entities that were not in the RMD. But I think for the most part, and Linda, you might have a good view of this as well. I think for the most part, it's pretty limited. I think everybody's at this point done a good job getting into the RMD and doing all the paperwork. Now, the next step is getting more details that some of the new orders come up with as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that some are trying to route around us, but we have identified all of our partners, and those who were not in the RMD, we said we're not taking your traffic any longer. A couple of them, once we said that, got registered in the certified in the RMD, but we just sever our relationship with them.
Well, that's a great segue about the RMD. So what's involved in the RMD, and what's involved in filing a certification and just filing a robocall mitigation data plan in the FCC's robocall mitigation database. Now this database is right on the FCC's website. If you type in Google FCC robocall mitigation database, you'll see the database. You can see everybody that's filed. Most people file it publicly. Some file it, a public version that's redacted, but you can see it. But what's all involved?
So I can talk about what AT&T is, and basically it was pretty easy. Of course, there's some specifics that the FCC required, but we have had a comprehensive robocall mitigation plan for many, many years, which involves monitoring our network, identifying suspicious calling patterns, and then investigating to make sure, because sometimes good calls look like bad calls, investigating to make sure that they're truly bad, and then blocking the calls. We also work with our analytics company who additionally will label the calls and block calls that they see as illegal robocalls. We work with the Traceback Group. We work closely with enforcement, and all of that, we have a Know Your Customer program to make sure that our customers are not those that are originating illegal robocalls. So all those components should be included in a good robocall mitigation plan.
Great. Nick, do you have anything to add?
And I agree with Linda. It's a fairly easy process. To do, probably the toughest thing is if you don't have an FRN, an FCC registration number, is getting that taken care of. But the actual information that's provided, initially when the FCC rolled it out, I think it was pretty loose as far as what counted as a robocall mitigation plan and the requirements around it. They're definitely stepping up enforcement of that. One of the last report and orders requires a lot more detail around what's needed in that robocall mitigation plan, but for the most part, what they're looking for is just information on each company, then OCN if you have it, what type of attestation or stir-shaken deployment do you have? Are you fully implemented, partial, no implementation? And then the robocall mitigation plan right now has a lot of different requirements as to what they're looking for. So one, they want to see that you have a written plan that you deploy within your network to ensure that you are stopping new customers and removing customers that have illegal robocalling and ensuring that they don't come back onto the network. And then they're also looking for, and that's for every customer, even if you're fully stir-shaken compliant. Some of the other things that they're looking for is that that you not only have that plan, but you have a strong Know Your Customer and Know Your Upstream Provider plan, that you have implemented those plans.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've noticed with the folks that have filed in the robocall mitigation database, some are flimsy, some are comprehensive, but at the end of the day, carriers got to be careful just because everyone's looking at those robocall mitigation plans. The state attorney generals are looking at them. The FCC's looking at them. The Federal Trade Commission's looking at them. If there's traffic that's suspect that's going through your network and you don't have a strong robocall mitigation plan, their spotlight's going to be on you, and you're going to have to be answering for that, and it's going to be problematic. So best to have a comprehensive plan and learn from the comprehensive plans that basically check you through the various requirements, whether they be for call authentication, what applies to you, and all the obligations there, and the call blocking too. It's a little bit complicated as you put the two realms together into one plan, but you should have the plan, and that's how you can implement it to show that you're just checking off those things, and these are part of your consideration and qualifications. I think the next thing I want to turn to is, relative to what issues is the industry traceback group facing right now, and carriers facing relative to those carriers that are foreign voice service providers and foreign intermediate providers when the industry traceback group is trying to get traceback and call information. Are you running into issues there? Because they all have to file in the robocall mitigation database. They all have to say, hey, we're going to answer tracebacks, and then the push comes to shove, can they answer those tracebacks based upon the foreign laws?
So the ITG is fairly successful, very successful at identifying the source of the illegal robocalls. But the backup is that the gateway provider, as we just discussed, is kind of the stopping point at, is the entry to the U.S. And the gateway providers, we definitely monitor our network. We work as soon as we get notified by ITG. If we haven't identified it ourselves first, as soon as we're notified that somebody is sending us illegal robocalls, we put the pressure on whoever is sending us the calls and work to get it stopped. So it's effective.
Right.
And one thing I would add is we've actually removed customers that aren't responding to the traceback group. That we take it seriously, and so that is going on in the industry. That if you're not responding, I know we've removed customers before for that reason alone, that they're not responding.
And beyond the ITG is the traffic pumping and take back group as well. And when you think about it from that perspective, a lot of that is focused certainly on the majority of it is focused on toll-free numbers. But with toll-free numbers, there are use cases where through impersonation or whatever the case may be, right, that those numbers are being either used specifically from an impersonation perspective where you'll receive a call from a spoof number. The anticipation is that you actually won't answer the call, they'll leave you a voicemail. Within that voicemail, they'll leave you a toll-free number. You'll call that toll-free number back, it'll take you to a spoofed or fabricated IVR that emulates the actual impersonation. So that could be a cable utility or something of that nature with the intent that you call it back. You go through the IVR, you pick it. Doesn't matter what number you pick from the IVR perspective, it's going to take you to the fraudster for them to fake you as far as an unpaid bill or something of that nature. Or save 50% on your bill if you sign up for this. So with the traffic pumping take back group, we're actually able to turn down toll-free numbers within a matter of minutes as they're identified in those impersonation schemes. So it's other additional layers above and beyond this that we can take.
Right. There's the intent to steal your identity through this scam call that has occurred. Jim, do you have any perspectives on this as well, and relative to dealing with?
Not with traceback.
Not with traceback.
Yes.
Right. But one thing I can just correlate to what we just talked about with the Social Security that just came up before the hand. But you see, the discussion was you get these calls and they can see what the call is. And sometimes with the traceback, when they do send it back to you, sometimes you do get the voicemail message or you can get the statement of what was going on. So at that point in time, you're getting that message back from traceback saying who originated this call, and you know what it was. If it was a Social Security scam, you know it was. And at that point in time, it's a hot potato because there's no tolerance by the government for that. And if you get a call from the Federal Trade Commission, if you get a call from Social Security and they're saying, why are you allowing that type of traffic to go through your network? You knew. Based on this traceback, we sent it to you, you saw it, there was the voicemail, it was a startling voicemail. Why did you continue to handle the traffic from this carrier? You knew or should have known, and you continue to route that traffic. So that puts you in the hot seat. Why don't we move on to the next order? Because we just talked only about the last year's May 20th order on the gateway provider, but we're going to turn next to the March 17th, 2023 sixth reporting order. So Nick, if you could just provide a high-level summary of that order and the new requirements imposed under it, that'd be great.
Sure. So probably the biggest part of that requirement was if you are the first SIP receiver of an unsigned or unauthorized call or unvalidated call, that you are required to sign that call. So if you're the first one to receive it, you sign that, and realistically you're going to be signing that with the C attestation. There's some caveats to that because you may not always know if you were the first one, because there's actually some parts of the rules that say if you're not the first one, you don't have to sign for that. But for the most part, and at Cinch, we've taken the approach, and we're going to take the approach with this, that if we receive an unsigned call, we're going to be signing that with the C attestation. And that must be done by the end of this year. All companies must file a robocall mitigation plan within the RMD. It used to be that just the partial attestation and no attestation companies needed to file that plan. Now all companies must file that plan. So even AT&T, who is fully stir-shaken compliant, must file that robocall mitigation plan. They've already done that, but all companies must do that.
So somebody who's fully implemented stir shaken, they just already did it, they checked the box, because before, when you just uploaded the file, they wouldn't even let you do an upload for any robocall mitigation plan. So presumably now they're going to have to file something.
Correct. So we're in the process of going through and updating all of our plans as well, and we're going to be filing that. So yeah, no matter what type of attestation level you are or deployment you have with StirShaken, you must file a robocall mitigation plan. And that's what we were talking about earlier, some of the things that they're looking for.
Does that include resellers, folks that don't even control the network? I mean, everybody has to file at this point.
Everybody does, as far as I think
Everybody has to file.
Yes.
Right? It's everybody across the board. If you're reselling somebody's service, if you're sending any types of traffic, even if you did not control it, that's what the FCC came down and said, we want everybody to have a robocall mitigation plan. So you will have to file.
Yep. And then some of the other things are, if you are a service provider, intermediate or terminating, and somebody's not in the robocall mitigation database, you are not allowed to take calls from them. And then probably one of the most interesting things in that last order is the fact that it gives the FCC additional power of enforcement, especially as it's related to the robocall mitigation database, and that language around if you're not in there, people cannot take calls from you. And so there's a lot of power that the FCC is going to have, I think, to really help the industry remove illegal robocalls.
Well, that's an excellent point. Linda, maybe that's a great segue, too, if you can talk about the enforcement under this 6th report and order.
Yeah, so before I get to enforcement, one of the things the FCC did was bring everybody under the control of their control in the robocall mitigation database. And the reason for that is that, we were talking about, even if you're fully stir-shaken implemented, should you be in the robocall mitigation date? Absolutely, you should be in the database, because not all robocalls are spoofed. And as we talked about before, that's what stir-shaken does. It identifies that a call was not spoofed. There are a lot of illegal robocallers that get blocks of numbers, and their calls rightly get an A attestation, but they're scam calls. And so everybody needs to monitor their network and identify the illegal robocalls. So now that everybody's under that jurisdiction, the steps that the FCC have taken can really help, as Nick was saying, help the industry by identifying and placing consequences. The first consequence is additional penalties for refusing to block an illegal robocall under the FCC's requirements. That's a monetary penalty. The other penalty is removing the provider from the robocall mitigation database. Once the providers remove them from the robocall mitigation database, nobody can accept their calls, so that chokes off the traffic. They also have enforcement for repeat offenders, where they will take away their authorization to act as a service provider. So they are taking, they're also expediting the process of removing a provider from the robocall mitigation database. Everybody gets notified if their robocall mitigation plan is insufficient, and one of the signs of an insufficient robocall mitigation plan is transmitting or originating illegal robocalls. So they'll be notified, and then they have 10 to 14 days, depending on what category they fall into, to rectify. And if they don't rectify it, then the FCC will remove them. And so the other thing the FCC is doing is trying to zero in on not just the companies, but also the owners, the directors, everybody involved in the company, because they want to make sure that if we'll close down this company and start up a new one, that they have ways to start identifying that as well.
So the FCC is really showing a lot of rigor relative to this. And Jim, I really welcome your thoughts on how you believe these new requirements will curb illegal robocalling in the United States.
So, Philip, could you repeat that?
How do you think these new requirements under the sixth report in order will stop illegal?
I think the sixth report in order is really important. You know, just there are a lot of loopholes that this is starting to plug. The FCC is starting to plug, and you know, making everybody file a robocall mitigation plan, that's big. And I tell you the fact, because we've seen so many times, I'm full shaken, and that company is not implemented shaken. They don't even have an SBC code.
Right.
Their calls are being signed by the intermediate provider. They're getting an A or a B, and they're robocalls. And you know, those people need a robocall mitigation plan, and they need to be taken to task when they have, you know, a robocall. And you know, I have to share just a little story. This is just Friday afternoon, right before the end of work. One of our customers, they got they got a scam call. Somebody trying to get their credit card number, you know, pretending to be utility. And that call was, you know, had an A attestation. It was signed, and it was signed by a good company. You know, it wasn't some fly-by-night company, but it got through. It got through their vetting process, and you know, they probably have a UCAS subsidiary is what it looked like that had made it really easy to sign up for calls. And you know, they gave them their credit card, and they started making these calls and tried to dupe somebody. So I think the sixth report in order, you know, that company didn't need a file because they'd implemented Shaken. Now they're going to need a robocall mitigation plan. They're going to need to go back and think about, wow, we need to fill out, you know, how do we know our customers now? They hadn't really probably done that. They were good folks, but hadn't sat down to really think about what are our processes. We need to get this right. So I think that, you know, the sixth order and the seventh order that's coming out, these are all really good things. There are a lot of holes to close.
Yeah, the sixth order is very comprehensive, and just everybody has an action item on there, some more than others. But speaking, you just mentioned the seventh report in order. Justin, why don't you provide an overview of that order? And that hasn't been adopted yet.
No,
right?
that's exactly right. So this is something that, from an adoption perspective, this is actually part of the FCC open meeting coming up this Thursday. And again, the seventh report order takes it even further with regards to continuing to plug those holes, extending the 24-hour traceback requirement to all service providers that are in the call path. That's first and foremost. And then beyond that, the originating providers are required to block illegal calls when notified of such traffic by the commission. And then extending that know your customer requirement to all service providers. But I think what's most important about this, or some of the additional attributes associated with this one, is again continuing that mantra from a robocall mitigation database and updating your certification to include traceback compliance. So now it's taking that a step further with regards to the intelligence within the RMD. But this one, I think, ties to what was stated just a minute ago from Jim, is effective measures to prevent new and renewing customers from originating illegal robocalls. And I think that, again, is critical. I think, Nick, you stated as well with regards to, as you see these customers come online, go offline, switch traffic from one to the other, so on and so forth, the ability to be able to just stop that immediately. Based on them swinging their traffic to different providers.
So as a question to the whole panel, the FCC's imposed a whole bunch of new rules and requirements on the industry. What are you seeing right now relative to tracebacks and enforcement efforts as a result of all these new rules and obligations?
I can go. We've seen, and not just from the FCC, but you know, the FCC, the FTC are definitely stepping up their enforcement. The state attorney generals have a coalition that have come out and said their goal is to make it too expensive to carry illegal robocalls for companies. So you see a combination of what all three of those entities are doing, and then what they can do with some of the rules around the robocall mitigation database and removing companies from that. You know, I really do believe we're at a point where here in the very near future, a lot of the issues that we see with illegal robocalling are going to be greatly reduced. We were talking about this earlier, the car warranty scams that were so prevalent for many, many years. The state AGs went after those and really did a great job of stopping them. There's some charts, and we obviously don't have them here, but they've gone to very, very low amounts. So when those targeted responses from the different agencies happen, they can be very powerful. I think that's just going to keep expanding over the next few years.
Linda, please.
Yeah, we're not done though. I mean, the traditional types of robocalls, we're seeing some progress. We're seeing some reduced numbers of robocalls, but we're also seeing some change campaigns. So we can't give up. We got to keep watching it. We got to keep monitoring it, and we got to keep developing new tools in our toolbox to go after these guys. Because I mean, so now we're seeing more targeted campaigns where they're using numbers to target groups of people. And maybe those numbers aren't spoofed, but we have to find better ways of identifying and detecting and labeling and going after those. It's just going to keep changing. I think we're going to get on top of it, but we just got to keep watching and not relax.
So Jim, you have your finger on the pulse in this, in the latest efforts by the FCC and where things stand. What are you seeing at this point in time? Is there an improvement? Is it, where are the weaknesses, where are the strengths?
Yeah, I tell you, unfortunately, I mean, we don't see a lot of improvement in terms of total robocalls. And, I think all these things that we've talked about, these new orders, are good things. They're the right things that need to be done. And in the further proposed rulemaking, they're going to be looking at, can intermediate providers sign on behalf of originating service providers? I think that's a big hole that needs to be plugged. But, there's still a lot of robocalls out there. And I guess kind of the elephant in the room is there are a ton of unsigned calls. And those are very hard to deal with more difficult to deal with from a robocall analytics point of view. And it makes enforcement more difficult. I mean, it gives you a way to hide in the crowd of unsigned calls. And so, the transition to an all IP network, I mean, that's I guess, what the FCC can do to kind of encourage that is going to be a big, big factor. There's been success. A lot of things are in place, but it's a journey, and we've got a long way to go. And I think it's going to be worth the effort, because when you get to the end, and we're going to get to the point, if a call's not signed, it's going to get blocked. It's not verified with AI attestation. It's probably going to be blocked, and that'll be fantastic for telephone service providers. I mean, it means the telephone network will be the only trusted communications medium. There's so many out there you compete with, but it'll be the only one you can really trust. That'll be awesome. But I think we're a long way from there, Philip. It's going to be a few more years.
Justin, you guys are at Somos are at the cutting edge of a very comprehensive do not originate list, and the FCC is stepping up on the DNO. Originally, it just started with, hey, just gateway providers blocking calls, and now they're looking at this latest order to require everybody to block. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, neighborhood spoofing, people on all the different types of calls that are going out using other calls, numbers that you think are local but they're not, your neighbor, but...
Yeah, and I think that's, again, where you take it to the next level, right? From an FCC perspective, the reasonable list, like I said earlier, is inclusive of those unassigned, unallocated, and invalid numbers. But, again, when you think about it beyond that, there are a lot of numbers that are in service, and it ties to what Jim just stated, that are actually being used to spoof that can actually be stopped if they get loaded into the DNO list from a manual set perspective. Case in point is smart meters. From a smart meter perspective, I've been working a lot on the power side, I've been working a lot on the water side, and understanding that particular ecosystem. And as they transition from AMR into AMI, from a new technology perspective, they want the ability to have two-way communication. The ability for them to have that two-way communication is to now incorporate 5G ecosystem, which now assigns a number to, again, a device that's never going to place calls, that's never going to send texts. So if we can actually take those numbers, we don't have to do anything with regards to the use of the number. The number can be used for that data transfer and so on and so forth. But again, if we take those numbers and we actually populate them above and beyond the 3 criteria that the FCC has stated, now you have something that's powerful that actually puts the brakes on at the front of the vehicle, right? Before it actually has to get to the engine of authentication, right? So I think that's kind of the next step of where we need to go above and beyond that.
Well, speaking of what's the next step, and we're talking about the United States, we're just one state of a whole wide world of different voice networks that have to work together. It's a patchwork quilt. We're on the cutting edge, I would think, to some degree than others, but others are catching up pretty quickly. What are you seeing right now, Nick? And maybe you can provide your thoughts on that, because we're just one country.
Yeah, I know Canada is also deploying a stir-shaken type ecosystem that's very similar to the U.S., although it's a little further behind. Jim, I think you're probably doing some attestation in Canada, aren't you?
I'm sorry, Nick, could you repeat that?
About Canadian attestation in their stir-shaken deployment?
You've stumped me on that. On Canadian attestation, is
Right,
it different from what we have in the U.S.?
No, I was saying it's very
excuse me.
similar to what we're doing in the U.S. as well. And then as far as other countries, I can't speak to many individually, but I know that there's everybody's looking at it. Everybody's looking at different ways to utilize what we've done in the U.S.
So France is has actually put out theirs from a mandate perspective that I believe is June of this year. And that's the implementation of stir shaken, and it's holistic, right? It is a stake in the ground implementation across all providers. The UK is in consultation right now as it relates to looking at the potential of stir shaken from a UK perspective. There are some other activities that are happening with regards to, I believe Ireland is implemented a do not originate. From that standpoint, so there's, again, it goes back to your patchwork quilt, right? Not only domestically, but internationally. But I think that's what's key and critical as well, is that if as an international community, we have the ability to actually have authentication from origin to termination, regardless of whether it's domestic or international, I think that's going to be key and critical, right? Now, is there going to be, is stir shaking going to be that finite solution? Maybe not, right?
Linda?
Yeah, and in addition to the countries that are looking at stir-shaken, there's also some efforts of a non-jurisdictional, like governance authority, where they will work with individual companies in different countries and do the attestation level. But it's really important as we work with our partners internationally that we don't just focus on stir-shaken, and that's the regulators and the companies. I mean, we need to develop a traceback process in those countries, and all the other tools need to be stressed as well.
Right. At the end of the day, we're protecting our network. We want other countries to protect their network and have good traffic, so the voice network overall is reliable and trustworthy. Well, that concludes our time. I would love to thank you for our panelists for doing a tremendous job. I really appreciate it. We should give them a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon, and have a successful rest of the ITW. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip, and thank you to all our speakers for that great session. We've got one more session today, which is